Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books, including his most recent, The Sickness is the System, when capitalism fails to save itself from, or save us, excuse me, from pandemics or itself. Democracyatwork.info, rdwolff with 2fs.com, Prof Wolff on Twitter with 2 Fs. Professor Wolff, welcome back. Ron Paul was on this hobby horse for most of my lifetime of end the Fed. But, you know, now there are Republicans, particularly at the state level. There's been a bunch of Republicans, you know, these sovereign citizen type, like out of Idaho, who are claiming that the Fed is some part of some international communist conspiracy designed to destroy America, and we need to end the Federal Reserve Board. Seems like it's a good time for a primer on, or primer, however you pronounce that word, on what is the Fed, why is the Fed, and what would happen if we did that, if we got rid of the Fed?
Okay, there are two ways to answer this question. The first is with a little bit of history. Every capitalist country has a central bank. Every capitalist country has long ago discovered that if you leave the question of money, the central issue of capitalism, if ever there is a central issue, if you leave that in private hands, the private folks, the banks and others who control it, will abuse that control, will use their control of money to profit themselves and to destabilize the larger economy that relies on money. So you take it away from the private, at least in part, and you give the government a kind of oversight, a kind of dominating role, and that institution that does that is called the central bank. In England, it's called the Bank of England. In France, it's called the Bank of France, and so on. We can't do that here because we have a prior history in the 19th century of something called the Bank of the U.S. that got caught up, you're surprised, by corruption and misuse. And so we didn't have a central bank for a while. We suffered the results of not having it. So at the beginning of the 20th century, basically, the decision was made, let's have our own central bank, but we called it a funny name, the Federal Reserve. So that's how we have it. Its job is to do pretty much what central banks do everywhere. So now let's change the focus and talk about that. Capitalism, and this is the key issue, is an unstable economic system. Every 4 to 7 years, wherever capitalism has settled in, it has had a cycle, a crisis, a downturn, a recession, a depression. We have a lot of words for it because it's always, if not upon us, coming near anytime soon. Like we're all now wondering when the recession will hit that we're due for either later this year or early next. And so long ago, people complained, businesses, individuals, workers, this instability is intolerable. As I used to say to my students in classes, if you lived with a roommate as intolerable as capitalism, you would have, as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Well, we can't move out of our societies for the moment, so efforts were made to try to control it. The most important of these was the work of John Maynard Keynes. In the United States and Britain in the 1930s, our capitalism collapsed. Mr. Keynes in Britain figured out two basic ways for the government to step in and to do something when the economy tanked, to come in there. And sometimes if it didn't tank, if it shot up in an inflation like we have now. One of the two things is called monetary policy. That's the Federal Reserve's job, is to apply monetary policy. Very simple to explain. If the economy is going down, you lower the interest rates so that people can have an easier, cheaper time borrowing, because you hope if borrowing is easier and cheaper, more businesses and people will do it, and that will put people to work. If you have an inflation, the opposite, well, then you raise interest rates as we are doing literally this month, in order to slow down the spending of money in the hopes that that will persuade businesses not to raise their prices, at least not as much as before. That's all. No conspiracy, no nothing. It's an attempt by a system that is very unstable, that has never figured out how to prevent that instability from playing out over and over again, to try to limit the damage, to have an authority come in and do something with interest rates in order to try to keep some problem from not exploding into a full-scale collapse. And by the way, Mr. Keynes's other policy is called fiscal policy. There are only two: monetary, fiscal. Monetary is playing around with the money system. Fiscal is having the government raise or lower taxes, raise or lower spending. There we have it. The government's job through monetary policy and fiscal policy is to offset, to limit, to constrain the inherent instability of the system. An intelligent person watching this for the last century and living through it now would, I hope, be able to cognize, to have in their brain the question, why do we keep lamely and ineffectively trying to compensate for an unstable system when we could and should ask the question, maybe there's a system different from this one that isn't so unstable in the first place.
Does not Cuba have a central bank?
Yes, everybody does.
Oh, okay.
Even socialist countries have what they used to call socialist countries, have their central bank. Bank of China does this in China. Russia has a bank that does it in Russia. Yeah, everyone has this, because until you do go beyond the employer-employee way of organizing enterprises, both state and private, until you go beyond that, you're going to have these decisions made by employers that have a structure, if you like, that produces these cycles. We've had them for 3 centuries. We've never stopped it. We've never overcome it. We are literally awash today in conversation about the inflation we're in and the recession that's coming down the pike, as if we haven't been through this 1,000,000 times in the last century and a half. There's nothing new. There's nothing surprising. Actually, there is a new and surprising thing that we would think that it's new and surprising. That won't worry us.
I get it. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Richard Wolff. I appreciate your dropping by today, and thank you for the lesson in central banking.
All right. Thank you.
Great talking with you.